And he always said that marriage is just a piece of paper. We didn't have that piece of paper, but we had a marriage-like relationship in every way. And as such, he was in my home as my life's partner, with access to my children and encouragement from me to be attentive to my children.
In November of 1967, a lawyer walked onto the set of a horror film in New York City, found the 22-year-old star between takes, and handed her an envelope. Inside were divorce papers. The man divorcing her was her husband, the most famous entertainer alive, and this was how she found out the marriage was over. Her name was Mia Farrow. She was filming Rosemary's Baby, the movie that would make her a star, and the papers had been sent by Frank Sinatra. She had married him a year earlier. She was 21, he was 50. The age gap was 29 years, and it had scandalized Hollywood, because Frank Sinatra was not just any 50-year-old man. He was old Blue Eyes, the voice of a generation, a titan who had been famous since before Mia Farrow was born, a man whose previous wife had been Ava Gardner, one of the great beauties of the century, and now he had married a wayfish, elfin, 21-year-old actress who weighed barely 100 pounds and looked, with her famously cropped hair, closer to a teenage boy than a movie star's wife. People thought it was absurd, people thought it wouldn't last, and people were cruel about it. Frank's own friends made jokes. Ava Gardner reportedly said she always knew Frank would end up in bed with a boy. But here is the thing that everyone missed, laughing at the age gap. Mia Farrow and Frank Sinatra genuinely loved each other. She would say, decades later, when asked directly if Sinatra was the great love of her life, one word: yes, she meant it. The marriage was not a joke to her. It was the real thing, entered into by a young woman who had come to Sinatra, in her own devastating words, as an impossibly immature teenager, without any person or system she could rely upon, and who clung to him, and who loved him truly. So why did he divorce her, on a film set, through a lawyer, without warning? Because she would not quit the movie. Frank Sinatra had a specific idea of what a wife was for, and it did not include a career. He was on record saying he was a pretty good provider, and could not see why a woman would want to do anything else. He wanted Mia to stop acting. He wanted her home. And when Rosemary's Baby ran over schedule, and he demanded she walk off the film to be with him, she faced the choice that would define her life. She was the daughter of a director and an actress. She was in nearly every shot of the film. She was 1 month from finishing the role that would make her famous in her own right, independent of the man she had married. And she could not walk away from it. So he walked away from her. He sent the lawyer. He served the papers on set. And he ended the marriage on the exact fault line it had always been balanced on, which was the question of whether Mia Farrow was allowed to be her own person, or whether she existed to be Mrs. Frank Sinatra and nothing else. She chose herself. It cost her the great love of her life. This is the story of a girl whose childhood ended at 9 in a polio ward, who married a legend at 21, who was served divorce papers at 22 for the crime of finishing a movie, and who spent the rest of her life understanding what that marriage had been, and what it had cost her to survive it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Mia Farrow's childhood looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale, and it was over by the time she was 9 years old. She was born Maria de Lourdes Villiers Farrow on February 9, 1945, in Los Angeles, the third of 7 children, into what was essentially Hollywood royalty. Her mother was Maureen O'Sullivan, the Irish-born actress famous for playing Jane in the Tarzan films of the 1930s and 40s, one of the most recognizable women in American cinema. Her father was John Farrow, a successful and respected film director and writer, an Australian-born Catholic intellectual with a formidable temper and a serious drinking problem. Mia grew up in a mansion, surrounded by movie stars and gossip columnists. Her godmother was Luella Parsons, the most powerful gossip columnist in Hollywood. She was, by every external measure, a privileged child of the industry's golden age. But the fairy tale had rot underneath it, the way these fairy tales always do. Behind the walls of the beautiful house, there was money trouble, there was marital tension, there was her father's drinking, and there was, on occasion, violence. The glamour was real, and so was the damage, and the two coexisted in a way that taught Mia, very young, that appearances and reality were different things, that the beautiful surface could conceal something painful, and that safety was not something you could count on, just because everything looked perfect. Then, when she was 9 years old, she got polio. It is difficult, now, to convey what a polio diagnosis meant to a child in 1954. It was one of the most feared diseases in America, a virus that could paralyze or kill, and the standard response was isolation. Mia was taken from her home, separated from her parents and her 6 siblings, and placed in an isolation ward at Los Angeles General Hospital, where she stayed for months, alone, a 9-year-old girl cut off from everyone she loved, not knowing whether she would walk again, terrified that she might have infected her family before she was taken away. She survived. She was, medically, one of the lucky ones. The polio left her with no permanent physical damage. But the isolation left something else. She said, decades later, that the illness marked the end of her childhood. A 9-year-old who spends months alone in a hospital ward, contemplating paralysis and death and the fear of having harmed the people she loves, does not come out of that experience a child anymore. She came out fragile, introspective, and marked by an early, intimate knowledge of isolation and fear that most children are spared. The opening pages of her memoir, written 40 years later, are about that ward, because her entire understanding of her own life was filtered through it. And the losses kept coming. When Mia was 13, her older brother Michael, 19 years old, was killed in a plane crash. The security of the family, already strained, was shattered. Then, when she was 18, her father, John Farrow, died of a heart attack. The formidable, difficult, hard-drinking man at the center of the family was suddenly gone, and the effect on Mia was profound and lasting. Because here is the pattern that a childhood like this creates. A girl loses her sense of safety early, through illness and isolation. She loses a brother. She loses her father, the powerful older man at the center of her world, while she is still a teenager, still forming, still needing him, and she is left with a specific kind of vulnerability, a longing for the security that keeps being taken from her, a susceptibility to powerful older men who might, finally, provide the stability and protection that her father's death removed. She was raised Catholic, educated in convent schools in Spain and England, and she retained throughout her life a genuine spiritual seeking, a searching quality, a need for meaning that ran deeper than the Hollywood world she came from. She was not a typical starlet. She was a strange, luminous, wounded, spiritually hungry young woman who had already survived more loss by 18 than most people survive in decades. When her father died in 1963, her mother moved the family to New York City, and there, almost immediately, Mia Farrow's own career began. Within months, she was modeling, and then she landed a role in an off-Broadway production of The Importance of Being Earnest, and the girl who had grown up watching her parents perform stepped, for the first time, into the light herself. She was about to become famous, and she was about to meet the man who would become the great love and the great wound of her life, a man 29 years older than her, a man almost exactly the age her father would have been, a powerful older man at the center of his own world, offering exactly the kind of protection a girl shaped by loss would find impossible to resist. By 1964, Mia Farrow was 19 years old and about to become one of the most talked-about young actresses in America, and the vehicle was a television show that scandalized the country. Her mother's move to New York had launched her. The off-Broadway work led to television, and in 1964, she was cast in Peyton Place, the primetime soap opera based on the notorious novel about the seething secrets underneath a respectable New England town. It was one of the first primetime soaps, and it was enormously popular and mildly scandalous, exactly the kind of show that made its young cast famous fast. Mia played Alison Mackenzie, the sensitive, wide-eyed ingenue, and audiences responded to her immediately. There was something about her on screen, a fragility, a luminous quality, an otherworldliness that set her apart from the conventional pretty girls of television. She looked like no one else. She was tiny, barely 100 pounds, with enormous eyes and delicate features, and she projected a vulnerability that the camera loved. And then she did the thing that turned her from a promising young actress into a genuine cultural phenomenon. She cut her hair. The haircut became one of the most famous in the world. Mia cropped her long hair down into a dramatic, boyish pixie cut, an almost shockingly short style for a young woman in the mid-1960s, when female beauty was defined by big hair and soft glamour. The cut emphasized her enormous eyes and her fragile bone structure and made her look like something not quite of this world, an elfin, androgynous, waifish creature, unlike any conventional Hollywood beauty. It was radical, it was widely imitated, and it made Mia Farrow, at 20, one of the most distinctive-looking famous women in America. She was, in other words, a rising star in her own right when she walked onto the 20th Century Fox lot in 1964 and met Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was 48 at the time, and he was not a rising anything. He was an institution. He had been famous since the 1940s, the Bobby Soxer idol who had become the definitive interpreter of the American songbook, the voice of "I've Got You Under My Skin" and "Come Fly With Me," and 100 other standards. He had won an Academy Award for From Here to Eternity. He was the center of the Rat Pack, the leader of the coolest and most powerful social circle in entertainment. He had been married 3 times, most famously to Ava Gardner, the great volcanic love of his life, a relationship that had burned both of them badly. He was one of the most powerful and famous men on the planet, and he carried himself accordingly. The meeting, by the accounts that survive, had an immediate charge to it. There was chemistry between the fragile 20-year-old and the 50-year-old legend from almost the first moment, a mutual fascination that neither of them seems to have entirely understood or resisted. On paper, it made no sense. He was old enough to be her father, older, in fact, than the age her actual father had been for most of her childhood. He came from a completely different world, the hard-drinking, tuxedo-wearing, old-school Hollywood masculinity of the Rat Pack, while she was a spiritually seeking flower child of the emerging counterculture. They had almost nothing obvious in common. But the things that draw people together are rarely the obvious things. Mia was a young woman who had lost her powerful father at 18 and carried a deep, formative longing for the security an older man might provide. Frank was a middle-aged man at the height of his fame who had been left raw by Ava Gardner and who found, in this strange, luminous, adoring young woman, something that reached him. She looked at him with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a strong figure to attach to. He offered her the protection and the certainty her life had been missing since her father died. It was, in the language of psychology that neither of them would have used, a near-perfect fit of 2 wounds, and it developed fast. The romance between Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow became, over the next 2 years, one of the most discussed and most mocked relationships in the world. The age gap was irresistible to the press and to Sinatra's own circle. He was 50. She looked, with her cropped hair and her 100 pounds, even younger than her actual age. The jokes were relentless and often cruel. But underneath the spectacle, something real was happening, and by 1966, Frank Sinatra had decided that he was going to marry the 21-year-old. The world thought he had lost his mind. Mia thought she had found the great love of her life. They were both, in their own ways, right. The wedding happened fast, and the speed of it tells you something about both the love and the pressure that surrounded it. They had been engaged, and Sinatra had gone to England to finish a film. Mia was back in the United States, staying in a small rented house, when the press discovered where she was and laid siege to it. She described the scene decades later with a kind of rueful comedy that does not fully hide how disturbing it was. There were cameras pressed against every window of the little house. There were no drapes, no curtains. Photographers surrounded the place, waiting to capture any image of Frank Sinatra's young fiancé. Mia had to crawl on the floor to move around her own home, staying below the level of the windows, army crawling across the floor to get a slice of pizza out of the refrigerator, because the moment she stood up, the cameras would fire. She said, with characteristic dry humor, that getting a pizza while lying on the ground is not easy. When Frank called from England, she pretended everything was fine. But he saw the siege on television, he understood what was happening to her, and he called and said, in effect, that they should just get married, now, to end the circus, to make her his wife, and give her the protection of that status. On July 19, 1966, Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow were married at the Las Vegas home of Sinatra's friend Jack Entratter, who ran the Sands Hotel. It was small and it was quick. Mia was 21, Frank was 50. She wore a simple dress. They cut a wedding cake. The photographs from that day show a genuinely happy couple. The tiny young woman beaming beside the impeccably dressed legend, and whatever the world thought about the match, the people in those pictures look like people in love. The world's reaction was immediate, loud, and unkind. The age gap was the entire story as far as the press was concerned. Frank Sinatra, 50, had married a girl of 21 who looked even younger than that. The columns filled with jokes. Sinatra's own friends, the hard-drinking men of his circle, needled him mercilessly. And Ava Gardner, Frank's third wife and the great love of his life, delivered the line that has followed the marriage ever since. She reportedly said that she always knew Frank would end up in bed with a boy, a reference to Mia's cropped hair and boyish figure, a remark that was cruel and cutting and designed to wound, and that captured the tone of how the whole world treated the marriage. As a joke, as an absurdity, as Frank Sinatra's midlife foolishness. What almost nobody took seriously was the possibility that the marriage was real, that these two people genuinely loved each other, that underneath the spectacle of the age gap, there were two human beings who had found something in each other that met a real need in both of them. But they had. Mia was not a gold digger or a starlet chasing fame. She already had her own career and her own rising stardom. Frank was not simply chasing youth. He was a man who had been emotionally battered by Ava Gardner and who found in Mia a devotion and a gentleness that soothed something in him. Their friends who looked past the jokes could see it. The marriage had a tenderness to it. Frank, who was famous for his volcanic temper and his tough guy persona, was, by Mia's account, in private a compassionate, shy, gentle man, more so than almost anyone she had ever known. She saw a side of him the public never saw, the man behind the old blue eyes performance, and she loved that man deeply. The problem was not love. The problem was never love. The marriage of Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow had plenty of love in it, real love, on both sides. The problem was that Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow wanted fundamentally different things from a marriage, and those two sets of wants could not be reconciled, and the fault line between them ran directly through the question of who Mia Farrow was allowed to be. Frank wanted a wife. Mia wanted to be a wife and an artist and a person in her own right. And in 1966, in the world Frank Sinatra had come from, those two things were understood to be incompatible. The collision was coming. It just took a year and a half and a horror movie to arrive. The marriage brought together two people from two different worlds, two different generations, and two completely different ideas of what a woman's life was supposed to be. Frank Sinatra's world was the world of the Rat Pack. It was tuxedos and cigarettes and whiskey at the Sands, late nights in Las Vegas, a masculine, mid-century, old-school Hollywood culture in which the men performed and caroused and ran things, and the women were beautiful and present and supportive. It was a world with fixed roles, and the role of the wife in that world was clear. The wife made the home. The wife was there when the man came home. The wife did not have a competing career that pulled her away, that required her to be on a film set in another city, that made demands on her time and her attention, that competed with her husband's. Mia Farrow's world was almost the opposite. She was 21, a child of the emerging counterculture, spiritually seeking, curious about Eastern philosophy and meditation and the larger questions of meaning that were sweeping through her generation. She was an artist with her own ambitions and her own rising career. She had grown up the daughter of a working actress and a working director. The idea that a woman would simply stop working, stop creating, stop being an artist because she had married, was foreign to everything she had known. These two worlds tried to merge, and the strain showed almost immediately, and it centered on Mia's career. Frank's position was not hidden or subtle. He was, as Mia later put it, on the record about it. He said that he was a pretty good provider and that he could not see why a woman would want to do anything else. That was the logic. He made plenty of money, he could take care of her, therefore there was no reason for her to work, and her continued desire to act was, in his framework, faintly insulting, an implication that his providing was not enough. Mia described the emotional weight of this beautifully and painfully. She said that was the way men thought then, and that you felt pretty guilty wanting something for yourself. That guilt is the key. She was made to feel that her own ambition, her own desire to be an artist, was a kind of selfishness, a failure to be properly grateful for the life her famous husband was providing. In Frank's ideal version of the marriage, Mia later said, she would not have done any movies at all. She would have been simply his wife. And for a while she tried to bend herself toward that. She loved him. She wanted to make him happy. She was, by her own repeated description, an impossibly immature young woman who had come to Frank without any stable person or system in her life to rely on, and she clung to him, and she wanted to be what he wanted her to be. But she could not stop being an artist, because being an artist was not a hobby she had picked up. It was who she was, bred into her by her parents, central to her identity. The collision took specific shape around two films in 1967. Frank was producing and starring in a crime drama called The Detective, and he wanted Mia to co-star in it with him. It was, in his mind, the ideal arrangement, a way for them to work together, on his project, under his control, as a unit. At the same time, Mia had been offered the lead in a film adaptation of a horror novel by Ira Levin to be directed by a young Polish filmmaker named Roman Polanski. The film was Rosemary's Baby, the story of a young pregnant woman in a Manhattan apartment building who slowly realizes that her husband and her neighbors have promised her unborn child to a satanic cult. The plan, initially, was that Mia would do both. She would film Rosemary's Baby and then move to The Detective. But Rosemary's Baby ran long. Film productions do. And as the schedule stretched, it became clear that Mia's continued commitment to Rosemary's Baby was going to interfere with Frank's film, and more than that, it was going to demonstrate, in a way Frank could not tolerate, that his young wife had a career and an artistic life that did not revolve around him. The role was extraordinary. Mia was in nearly every scene of Rosemary's Baby. It was the kind of part that makes a career, a lead role in what would turn out to be one of the most important films of the decade, directed by one of the most talked-about new directors in the world. For any serious actress, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And Frank Sinatra told his 22-year-old wife to walk off it. He had some dispute with the head of the studio, and, in Mia's recollection, his attitude was essentially, "I'm taking my girl out of this." He wanted her off the film. He wanted her with him. He gave her, in effect, an ultimatum, the marriage or the movie, and he expected, as Frank Sinatra generally expected, to be obeyed. Mia faced the defining choice of her young life, and she could not do what he asked. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. When Frank told her to leave the movie, Mia asked the only question she could ask. How can I leave it? She explained it later with a clarity that reveals how impossible the choice actually was. She was the daughter of a director and an actress. She had been raised inside the discipline of filmmaking, raised to understand that you do not walk off a movie, that a production is a collective effort in which dozens of people are depending on you, that a lead actor abandoning a film partway through is a kind of professional betrayal that damages everyone involved. Her mother was Maureen O'Sullivan. Her father was John Farrow. Walking off a set was not something a Farrow did. It went against everything she had been taught about what it meant to be a professional and an artist. And beyond the principle, there was the practical reality. She was in nearly every shot of Rosemary's Baby. The film could not simply proceed without her. She was the film. To leave would not be to step back from a supporting role. It would be to detonate the entire production, to abandon Roman Polanski and the cast and crew, to walk away from the lead in a movie that was 1 month from completion. 1 more month. That was all that was left. She was almost done. So she made her choice. She would finish the film. She would not walk off Rosemary's Baby, not even for Frank, not even to save her marriage. She chose the work. She chose herself. She chose to be Mia Farrow the artist, rather than only Mrs. Frank Sinatra. She did not fully believe he would actually end the marriage over it. She said as much later. She thought, on some level, that it would not really come to that the threat was Frank being Frank, that it would blow over the way storms in a marriage blow over. She just thought it wouldn't happen. It happened. One day in November of 1967, on the set of Rosemary's Baby, in the middle of the workday, a lawyer arrived. Frank Sinatra's lawyer. He came onto the set, found Mia, and served her with divorce papers. That was how she learned that her marriage was over. Not through a conversation. Not through a fight that reached a breaking point. Not through Frank himself sitting across from her, telling her he could not do this anymore. Through a lawyer, on her set, in her workplace, handing her legal documents in front of her colleagues while she was in the middle of making the film that the divorce was punishing her for making. It is one of the coldest endings to a marriage in the history of Hollywood, and it is cold in a very specific way. Frank Sinatra could be, as Mia herself testified, one of the most compassionate and gentle men she had ever known. But he was also a man of enormous pride and rigid ideas about authority and obedience. A man from a world where his word was final, and when his young wife defied him, when she chose her own art over his command, something in him closed like a door. He did not fight for the marriage. He did not compromise. He did not find a middle path. He ended it, and he ended it in the manner most calculated to make clear that her defiance had consequences, by reaching into the very set where she had defied him and delivering the papers there. The divorce was finalized in 1968. Mia Farrow was 23 years old. She had been married for less than 2 years to the great love of her life, and it was over. And it was over because she had refused to stop being herself. And here is the cruel irony that sits at the center of the whole story. Rosemary's Baby, the film she had refused to abandon, the film that cost her her marriage, was released in 1968 and became a sensation. It was a critical and commercial triumph, one of the defining films of its era. And Mia Farrow's performance as the fragile, terrified, slowly comprehending Rosemary was hailed as extraordinary. She was nominated for a BAFTA and a Golden Globe. The role made her a genuine film star, respected as an actress in her own right, no longer merely the young television actress who had married Frank Sinatra. The movie that ended her marriage made her career. She had bet everything on the work, on her right to be an artist, on her refusal to disappear into the role of the wife who exists only for her husband. And the bet paid off, professionally, completely. She became a star. She proved she was right about her own talent. But she had lost Frank, and the question of whether the trade was worth it, whether the career was worth the marriage, whether being herself was worth losing the great love of her life, was a question she would spend a very long time sitting with. Mia Farrow described the end of the marriage with an image so precise and so painful that it stops you cold. She wrote, in her memoir, that her time with Frank had been a little bit like being an adopted child, that she had somehow messed up, and that it was awful when she was returned to the void. Read that again, because it contains the entire psychology of who she was. She did not describe the divorce as losing a husband, or losing a lover, or losing a partner. She described it as being returned, as a child being sent back. She had come to Frank, in her own words, as an impossibly immature teenager without any person or system she could rely on, and she had clung to him, the way a child clings to a rescuing parent, and when the marriage ended, what she felt was not primarily the grief of a wife, but the terror of a child who has been given away, sent back to the void she had been trying to escape since her father died. That is why the marriage mattered so much, and why its ending cut so deep. Frank had not just been her husband, he had been, in the architecture of her wounded psyche, the powerful protector who filled the space her father's death had left, and losing him reopened the original wound, the abandonment, the isolation, the void she had first encountered in a polio ward at 9 years old. She had to find her way out of that void on her own, and the way she did it was characteristically strange, spiritual, and searching. In early 1968, in the immediate aftermath of the separation, Mia went to India. She travelled to Rishikesh, to the ashram of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, to study transcendental meditation, and she happened to be there at the same moment that the Beatles arrived to do the same thing. It became one of the famous gatherings of the decade, the Beatles and Mia Farrow, and a handful of other Western celebrities seeking enlightenment at an ashram in the Himalayan foothills. Her younger sister Prudence was there too, meditating so intensely and withdrawing so completely that the Beatles wrote a song trying to coax her out of her room. The song was, "Dear Prudence." Mia Farrow's sister is the Prudence in the Beatles song. The India trip was Mia doing what Mia did, which was to respond to devastation, by seeking meaning, by turning toward the spiritual, by trying to understand her suffering, rather than simply drowning it. It was the opposite of Frank's world of whiskey and defiance. It was a young woman trying to rebuild herself from the inside, and her career, freed now to be entirely her own, flourished. Rosemary's Baby had made her a serious film actress, and she worked steadily through the late 60s and into the 70s, building a body of work that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife. In 1970, she married again. Her second husband was André Previn, the celebrated composer and conductor, a brilliant and cultured man, and with him she began to build the large family that would become as central to her identity as her acting. She had twin boys with Previn, and then more children, and the couple adopted several children as well, including children from Vietnam and Korea, beginning Mia's lifelong commitment to adoption and to building an enormous, unconventional, multiracial family. The marriage to Previn lasted 9 years, longer than the marriage to Sinatra, and produced or brought into her life a whole cluster of children. That marriage, too, eventually ended in divorce in 1979. And Mia's romantic life would continue into its most famous and most catastrophic chapter, the long relationship with Woody Allen, that began in 1980 and ended in the early 1990s, in one of the most bitter and public ruptures in the history of American celebrity. A story so large and so painful that it belongs to its own telling and not to this one. But through all of it, through Previn and through Allen, through the growing family and the continuing career and the eventual turn toward humanitarian work that would define her later life, one relationship persisted in a form that surprised everyone who had watched it end so brutally. Her relationship with Frank Sinatra. Because the divorce papers on the set, cold as they were, final as they were, did not actually end the connection between Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow. It only ended the marriage. What remained, once the marriage was gone and the wound had scarred over, turned out to be something that lasted the rest of Frank Sinatra's life, and that revealed, in the end, that the love underneath the doomed marriage had been every bit as real as Mia had always insisted it was. Here is the thing almost nobody expects about the story of Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow. After the cruelty of the ending, after the lawyer on the set and the papers served without warning, the two of them stayed close for the rest of his life. They never fully let go of each other. The romantic marriage was over in 1968, but the friendship that replaced it ran deep and lasted 30 years, until Sinatra died. They talked. They stayed in contact through all of Mia's subsequent marriages and relationships, through Previn, through Alan, through everything. Frank remarried to Barbara Marx in 1976 and stayed married to her until his death, but his connection to Mia persisted alongside that marriage, a strange, enduring, affectionate bond between the 50-year-old legend and the 21-year-old he had married and divorced. There is a story, never fully confirmed but widely repeated and never really denied, that captures how deep the loyalty ran. During Mia's catastrophic legal war with Woody Allen in the early 1990s, Frank Sinatra was so enraged on Mia's behalf, so protective of the woman he had divorced a quarter-century earlier, that he reportedly offered to have Allen dealt with, in the way that a man with Sinatra's alleged connections might offer to have someone dealt with. Whether the offer was serious or literal hardly matters. What matters is that decades after the divorce, Frank Sinatra still regarded Mia Farrow as his to protect, still felt a fierce loyalty to her, still loved her in whatever complicated way he was capable of loving. And Mia never stopped loving him either. When she was asked, directly, late in her life, whether Frank Sinatra had been the great love of her life, she did not hedge or qualify or diplomatically spread the honor among her various husbands. She said, simply, yes. She also said, tellingly, that if she had stopped working, she believed they would have stayed married. She understood, looking back across the decades, exactly what the marriage had required of her, and exactly what it had cost her to refuse to give it. The price of staying married to Frank Sinatra was Mia Farrow ceasing to be an artist, ceasing to be a full person in her own right, disappearing into the role of his wife. And she had not been able to pay that price, and so she had lost him, and she knew it, and she loved him anyway. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82, and Mia Farrow, who had been served divorce papers by his lawyer on a film set 30 years earlier, grieved him as one of the most important people who had ever been in her life. She spoke about him afterward, with a tenderness that had survived everything. She said that the essential Frank Sinatra, the real man underneath the tough guy legend and the Rat Pack performance, was compassionate and shy and more readily available emotionally than almost anyone she had ever known. That is a remarkable thing to say about a man who ended your marriage by ambush. But Mia understood him. She understood that the cold gesture of the divorce papers and the gentle, wounded man underneath were the same person, that Frank Sinatra was a creature of enormous pride and rigid pride-bound rules who genuinely could not bend, and that his inability to let his wife have her own life was a limitation in him, not a lack of love. Look at the whole shape of it. A girl whose childhood ended at 9 in a polio ward, who lost her brother and then her father before she was grown, who came into adulthood carrying a bottomless need for the security that kept being taken from her. A 21-year-old who married a 50-year-old legend, a man almost the exact age her dead father would have been, and who clung to him as a rescue from the void. A marriage that had real love in it on both sides, and that was destroyed not by a lack of love, but by an irreconcilable conflict over whether a woman was allowed to be a person in her own right. A husband who could not tolerate his wife having a life of her own, and a wife who could not surrender the artist she had been raised to be. A choice, forced onto a 22-year-old between the great love of her life and the work that made her who she was. And a young woman who chose herself, who chose the movie, who chose to keep being Mia Farrow, and who paid for it with her marriage, and got in return the career that proved she had been right about her own worth. She was 21. He was 50. The divorce papers reached her on set without warning, and the reason they did was that Mia Farrow would not disappear, would not stop being an artist, would not become nothing but a wife, Even for Frank Sinatra, even for the great love of her life, she chose to exist as her own person. It cost her the marriage, and more than 50 years later, having built an extraordinary life on the far side of that choice, she still called him the great love of her life, and still said, quietly, that if she had only been willing to stop being herself, they might have made it. That was the trade, herself or him. She chose herself. And she spent the rest of her life understanding both what that choice had cost her and why she had never really had any other choice to make. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.